This is the companion video to the HarnMaster Kethira combat demo. It's not necessary that you have watched that one before this, but I do recommend it. If you haven't, though, and if you are looking to truly get a sense of combat in HarnMaster Kethira, I all but insist you watch the combat demo, perhaps for the second time, after watching this one. I don't want to make this a comprehensive tutorial covering every single aspect of HMK combat. And we're not going to go a mile deep covering every nuance of even the material presented herein. We're going to keep this fairly basic, as basic combat has plenty of details already to tickle thy fancy. Okay, verbose intro complete. Let's get it on! Let's start with an overview. Melee takes place in 5-second rounds, during which everyone gets a turn. On their turns, players and the GM take actions, some of which have conditional restrictions. Now, if I want to give a gross generalization of a combat round, which I do, and forgetting all of the cool nuances, it looks something like this. An attack is made, melee, missile, spells, or talents. Sometimes a defender gets to oppose this attack. Modifiers are applied, skills are tested, and victory stars are doled out. Injury severity is determined, and then the wounded party tests shock to see if he or she is vanquished. There's a lot of other details to this, but that's kind of the general flow. With that in mind, let's dig in and learn the basics of combat. We'll take a look at 5 main aspects of the combat round: alertness, initiative ranks, morale, engagement zones, and actions. Let's save actions for last, because the other 4 are going to help us figure out what we can and cannot do, and when we can or cannot do them. Alertness. Alertness gives us the status of a combatant's awareness to danger and foes. It's one of the primary determiners of what we can and cannot do. Our status is given as aware, confused, and unaware. Aware characters get to act normally throughout the round. This is the desired state of alertness for all combatants. Confused characters suffer some state of surprise, and it reflects just what it says, a general state of confusion. Such characters know something's going down, but either the suddenness of the activity or the inability to think clearly restricts actions. Confused characters have to pass on their turns, and they remain confused each round until they pass a reaction roll, which we're going to talk about in initiative, coming soon. When defending, confused characters may only block or dodge, and regardless of victory stars they might earn, they can't receive tactical advantages. Unaware characters are the most vulnerable. These people don't even know that they are in imminent danger. Not only can they take no actions, but the only defense they can offer is ignore. That's terrible. Once attacked, they get immediate reaction rolls, and if they succeed, they're now aware, but if their reaction rolls fail, they become confused. Still, that's a hell of a lot better than staying unaware, I'll tell you that. There's a special class of unaware called helpless. This would be against targets who are asleep, unconscious, bound, and that sort of thing. They are as vulnerable as unaware targets, but any attack against such targets is an automatic critical success versus the ignore defense. So, how are these states determined? Largely, this is a matter of situational GMing. The GM gets to determine the setup for enemies, and players get to determine their pre-combat actions upon spotting the enemy. For example, 2 parties stalking each other in an urban setting might surprise each other when they round a corner at the same time. They could all be defaulted to confused, or maybe the GM could call for immediate reaction rolls to determine starting alertness. Or the trekking routine can be used to set up an ambush several yards away, allowing for missile weapon discharges before anyone even gets close enough for melee. Or perhaps even someone uses stealth to sneak up on an opponent, which might be offset with awareness or might just be unopposed. Again, it's all situational, up to the GM. So with all that said, now don't you see the importance of setting up the combat scene? Just throwing hostiles at each other in an immediate face-to-face situation, it takes a lot of variables out of combat. It isn't fair to the players, or characters for that matter, and can destroy the plausibility of your scenario. Therefore, consider seriously the setups of your scenarios, especially when it comes to alertness. Initiative. Initiative plays several roles throughout combat. Primarily, Initiative ML determines turn order in the combat round. When organized from highest to lowest, the initiative score is referred to as the initiative rank, indicating when the combatant acts in the round. At times, initiative is also used in tests to determine actions that characters can or cannot take, often related to morale or alertness. This is often in the form of 3 types of tests: reaction rolls, morale rolls, and rally rolls. A reaction roll is just that. It's a reaction to a current condition. An initiative gets tested to try and improve that condition. It's a simple fail-success roll, in which a success improves the current condition, while a failure continues it. Usually these are made to improve one's alertness state, like when they're unaware or confused, or one's morale, either as an effort to steady oneself or in response to a rally roll. For the next 2 rolls, we're going to kind of start blending initiative into the morale section. A morale roll is an initiative roll that is made in response to certain catastrophes on the battlefield. On a more positive note, rally rolls are a type of test related to both of the other types. In a sense, they are reactions to changes on the battlefield, like a reaction roll, but it's triggered when teammates fail morale rolls. Under these circumstances, combatants can use a rally roll to steady their companions. Although not a straight test of initiative itself, a rally roll is actually a test of command, but it uses initiative as a secondary modifier. Morale. When it comes to morale, players generally get to determine or role-play their own morale, although the GM might rule a morale test is called for in certain situations. Morale rolls are generally left for NPCs. When called for, morale tests are made immediately, no matter the IR at hand. The 2 most common morale triggers are anytime a serious or grievous injury is suffered, and when at least half of your remaining allies are vanquished. Of course, the GM can call for morale tests given any number of other circumstances, like if the unit captain is killed. Successes allow combatants to continue fighting, possibly even stealing their resolve. But failures generate morale states that vanquish combatants, causing them to either flee or stand unaware in a catatonic state. Depending on the resulting status, combatants who failed a morale test are either forced to take a move action on their turns, or in the worst case, stand unaware and unable to move, act, or even defend. So we see, morale provides a perfectly viable option for vanquishing foes that doesn't require slaying everyone on the battlefield. Engagement. Next, we want to look at 2 terms: engagement zones and threatening. Engagement is a reference to proximity to a foe, indicating if someone is strikeable in melee. Only aware combatants exude engagement zones, and it's measured by either the combatant's reach or 5 feet, whichever is greater. Now, this right here, this is going to deserve some nitpicking, because assumptions can lead to confusion. Engagement is not synonymous with reach, even though these numbers can be the same. It's actually true that many or even most combatants will have an engagement zone equal to their reach. If you make this equivalency in your head, you'll be more likely to forget that someone with a short sword has a reach of 4, which you're going to use in the melee sequence, but he would have an engagement zone of 5. Well, why? Because 5 is greater than 4. It sounds like a minor detail, but the distinction is important. Being engaged does not mean you are attacking or being attacked. It just opens up that option. Let's consider combatants X and Y. It's possible for X to be in Y's engagement zone, but Y not being in X's engagement zone. Thus, engagement does not mean you're attacking. It means you're able to attack a target. And the potential to do that opens up with threatening. To threaten an enemy, the foe must be in your engagement zone, and you must be aware of the enemy. It doesn't take any time, and it can be done at any moment when the conditions are met.
Wait, does that mean someone can be unaware of someone being in your EZ?
Yeah, that's exactly what that means. Think of an assassin sneaking up on a target during combat. If all goes well, the assassin approaches until the target is in his engagement zone, and then he threatens him. Now, in game terms, threaten does not mean shouting, "I'm going to cave your skull in!" It just signals intent that I am indeed going to cave your skull in. In our example here, the target cannot threaten the assassin right back because he's not aware of him. Now, the assassin can attack and try to cave his target's skull in, and he gets to do this against the defense of ignore. So up to this point, we know that in order to enter hand-to-hand combat with other combatants, they must be in your engagement zone, and you must threaten them. 2 more points, though, before wrapping this up. Point 1, characters can freely move through EZs unless threatened. Once threatened, they must immediately stop in that EZ. Point 2, there's no penalty for leaving an engagement zone, and there's no special action for it. You can just leave it. The only restriction is you can't leave an EZ until the start of your turn. In other words, if you entered an EZ and got threatened and had to stop, you have to wait until the start of your next turn to move away. The action phase, the meat and taters of the combat round. In fact, all other areas, alertness, initiative ranks, engagement zones, and threats, and morale, they pretty much just get updated as necessary. So unless there are changes to those, combat rounds mostly roll from action phase to action phase. Before we get to the actions themselves, let's talk action times, because all actions have one of 3 times or durations. Free, 1 turn, or 1 or more rounds. Free actions happen so quickly that players can still choose an action afterwards, not before. These are largely adjudicated by the GM, but some examples are: draw a readily available weapon, such as from a sheath or a belt, pull an item out of a pocket, grab and load an arrow from a nearby location, laying on a rock, stuck in the ground, not from a quiver, open an unlocked door or container, command allies or intimidate foes, and take a 5-foot move, but this can't be combined with any other action involving movement. 1-turn actions are the most common. They start and end on the combatant's initiative rank. There's also a lot of GM discretion here. Most of the actions during this phase are 1-turn actions, and we'll examine those in more detail shortly. 1 or more round actions begin on the combatant's initiative rank, but they continue for the indicated number of rounds, during which the character must maintain concentration and can only choose the ignore defense if attacked. This most often pertains to spells and talents, but it can also apply to certain missile actions, like spanning a crossbow.
Wait a minute. Why can I only ignore as a defense? That sucks.
It does suck. But think about it. If you're doing something that is occupying both your time and attention beyond your own initiative rank, it means other people are still doing stuff while you're not paying attention and you're busy. Make sense? So with durations covered, let's now turn to the actions themselves. Each character selects 1 action. The actions are pass, move, incant, grope, evade, charge, and attack. Let's check these out. Pass. Well, I like this because it's quick and easy. When passing, the character does nothing but observe and defend. There you have it. Move. Characters move at a given rate, and their turns end immediately if they enter an engagement zone and get threatened. There are 3 types of move actions: full move, half move, and double move. A full move allows a character to move up to effective move. Think of it like a jog. It can possibly accrue fatigue during combat, but you have to be moving for a full 60 rounds before you have to worry about that. A half move is a move that goes up to half effective move. That's why it's called a half move. Well, why would somebody do that? Mostly if someone is trying to be stealthy or otherwise deliberately moving slowly, for reasons. A double move allows movement up to twice effective move. So this is like a dash or a sprint. Because it's an all-out run, if it's not in a relatively straight direction, the character is going to have to make a stumble roll. Also, personal fatigue is accrued each round of double movement, with an endurance secondary roll to offset this by 5. Incant. Another short one, because we ain't going to cover it in any more detail in this tutorial. Suffice to say, the incant action is used for spells and arcane talents. Grope. Gropes involve doing something involving the hands. They can be one-turn actions, like lifting an object or unslinging your shield from your back, or they can be one-round actions, like retrieving an item from your backpack. There's a lot of leeway here, and some actions might call for a fumble roll, depending on haste and complexity. Evade. Characters with no shock state take a one-turn action to evade missile attacks by moving between 10 feet and a half move. Once they complete that, any combatant taking a missile shot at an evading target suffers a penalty equal to that target's evasion skill. Charge. A charge involves an unthreatened character first taking up to a half move, and then either throwing, or, if now engaged with and threatening a foe, attacking in melee. Attack. So if all those were the potatoes, the attack is the meat. This action covers both missile and melee attacks, and we're going to look at each of these a bit more in depth on their own. A special note, though, regarding melee attacks. If, after your melee attack, you are unthreatened because maybe you killed your target or you're no longer in his engagement zone, you can barge for a half move through difficult terrain, a quarter move. But that's only for melee attacks. With that said, let's go in deeper on both types of attacks, and we'll begin with the missile attack sequence. The missile attack sequence breaks down into 3 phases, kind of like a mini-game. There's the missile action itself, and then if we're shooting or throwing, the missile range and the missile test. There are a number of missile actions that a combatant can take, and each depends on the missile weapon being used. Let's look at the available options individually. The span action is reserved specifically for crossbows. In order to prepare a crossbow to shoot, it needs to be spanned. While it is possible to span a wooden crossbow by hand, there are devices that aid in spanning the heaviest of wooden crossbows and all other crossbows: the belt and claw, the lever, and the windlass. While spanning the lighter crossbows can take just 1 round, using a composite or Kuzan crossbow, it's going to require the use of one of those spanners, and it could take as little as 2 rounds or as many as 8, depending on the required device. But this just spans the crossbow. It still needs to be loaded after that. Of significance, a character cannot move while spanning, and the only available defense option is ignore. Why is that? See earlier about action timing, right? You're paying attention to spanning, and doing so goes beyond your initiative rank, spilling over into other combatants' turns. The load action generally takes 1 round, assuming that a character is pulling an arrow or bolt from a quiver or a sling stone from a belt pouch. If, however, ammunition is within easier reach, then the GM can rule that loading is a free action. In order to load a missile weapon, a character's pull rating must equal or exceed the weapon's draw rating. Well, what is pull? Pull is archery ML and strength ML combined. So as long as this value checks out, your character can load and shoot the selected missile weapon. Should have been covered when buying the weapon, yes? And because this is something covered when acquiring said bow, pull is something we typically already know about before combat even begins. Just want you to know about it. Also, like spanning, no movement is allowed while loading, and the only defense option is ignore. Because why? 1 round action, that's why. See it all coming together now? The aim action takes 1 round and adds a 10-point bonus to missile EML. There's a special note about bows, though. The aim action can only be taken if pull exceeds the bow's draw by 75 or more. That's a lot. This means that although many people can shoot some type of bow, that's not a problem. There are physical limitations to being able to draw it and hold it while aiming. But with regards to crossbows and thrown weapons, there's no pull restrictions on the aiming. And no, you still cannot move while aiming, and the only defense available is ignore. 1 round action. Finally, the shoot and throw actions are 1-turn actions to discharge or launch the missile weapon. A charge falls under the same category, but it has the previously mentioned movement requirements of a charge, and it's only for throwing, not shooting. Now, to get a little wacky, shooting and charging allow for up to a half move. In fact, charging requires it. Meanwhile, no movement is allowed for the throwing action. Because all 3 are 1-turn actions, the character can defend normally. When selecting the shoot, throw, or charge actions, the attacker declares if he is aiming for any zone other than the standard zone 1. More on that later when we discuss injuries. Missile range. We need to know the range to target in order to determine both the type of shot as well as the modifiers associated with it. There are 2 types of missile attacks: direct shots and volleys. Think of a direct shot as a straight shot at a particular target. You're shooting directly at a target. A volley, even if you might want to hit a particular target, is too far away to be shot at directly, so you need to shoot high and arc into the target. It's like the area of effect version of a projectile. The range of the target then determines what kind of shot you can take, which in turn gives modifiers to your skill test. A direct point-blank shot has a 10-point bonus, while a volley 4, if your weapon can even shoot that far, has a 40-point penalty. Notice also the effect on zone dice. The direct shots have tighter zone grouping versus those of volleys. And then there are modifiers to impact, as well as separate modifiers for charging and throwing. Lastly, special penalties can be applied to base ranges for things like wet bowstrings. The missile test. Missile attacks are unopposed. Instead, the test will receive various modifiers, and certain conditions produce automatic results. The first consideration is the target's movement. Anyone who is either stationary, moving stealthily, or walking is considered a still target. There are no modifiers to the missile test, but any strike against a still target scores a precision tactical advantage automatically. A target is considered moving if it is either charging, which represents a quick burst of speed, or if it is taking a move action to go greater than half move, like a full move or double move. Such a target provides a 10-point penalty to the missile EML. A target that is either taking the evade action or is engaged in melee combat is considered evading. Such a target provides a penalty to the missile EML equal to the target's evasion. Now, beyond the target's movement, other penalties to the missile EML will be a 10-point penalty if the shooter took a half move, a 10 or 20-point penalty due to excessive crosswinds, heft penalty for thrown weapons and objects that the character isn't strong enough to wield normally, a 10-point penalty for throwing an object, 20 points if the object is oblong, fatigue and applicable impairment, range penalties for volleys 3 and 4, a 10-point bonus if the aim action was taken in the previous round, a 10-point bonus for point-blank range, and a 5-point bonus per target size greater than 1. Now, if after all of that, the final EML is minus 40 or worse, the attack is spoiled and there's no roll. With all of that factored in, the attacker makes a missile EML test, either with archery or throwing, and is awarded victory stars for success levels. Well, what do the results tell us? For a direct missile attack, any critical failure results in a combat mishap. CFs ending in a 0 result in a fumble roll, while those ending in a 5 force a stumble roll. Failures generally are a simple miss. However, if the missile EML was greater than 5, the shooter might strike another target. A success results in a strike, and if the target is considered a still target, a precision TA is earned. A critical success provides a second victory star for a tactical advantage. With volleys, this gets a little muddier, as it should, because it's a volley, not a directly targeted shot. Critical fails result in the same mishaps. With failures, you miss the 15-foot area at which you were aiming, but that projectile's landing somewhere. So there's a means for determining which 15-foot area is actually struck, and if there are targets there, we resolve that like we would as if it were a success, just hitting someone else. For successes, we earn what we're going to call a potential strike. The projectile does land in the targeted 15-foot area. Now we have the chance to hit something in that area, and there's a routine for this. But simply put, you total the number of targets in that area, roll a d20, and if the result corresponds to one of those targets, that's the one you hit. If the result is greater than the target account, well, the success is essentially wasted and the attack is a miss. We do that same routine for a failure, but we're checking to see if we hit a target as an oopsie. Critical successes are resolved the same as success, but a d10 is rolled instead of a d20, so it increases the chance of actually striking a target. Like I said, a bit muddy, but that's to be expected when you're lobbing projectiles over a great distance, especially into an active melee. The melee sequence. Melee attacks are both a little more involved and yet a little more straightforward. This follows a different sequence, primarily because opponents get to make opposed tests. Unlike missile discharges, melee combat is more of a direct competition between two fighters. The melee sequence involves engagement zones, attack and defense declarations, melee tests, and outcomes. Engagement. Characters with a readied weapon are eligible to make melee strikes against foes so long as they are aware of such foes, and those foes are within the engagement zone and threatened by said characters. Declarations. The attacker declares first who the target is, which readied weapon is being used, the desired strike aspect, and any other body zone at which to aim other than the default Zone 1.
Wait. Do I really need to declare the aspect of the weapon?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, the GM can rule that if it's not declared, it's the default aspect. That's up to the GM. Declaring the aspect also lets us get away from scenarios like, well, hang on, I didn't want to slay him. I just wanted to hit him with the pommel and try to knock him out, or something like that. But really, this is for the sake of the defender. The defender has a right to know what aspect is being used against him so he can declare his defense. With the attack declared, the defender declares that defense, and he gets options. He may block with a readied weapon, dodge, counterstrike with a readied weapon, and in this case he makes the same declarations as if he were an attacker, because he is, or ignore. To be fair, no one really selects this. It's typically forced or conditional rather than a choice. Melee test. The attacker makes a melee test. The defender's test is based on the chosen defense. The melee skill is used for block and counterstrike, while dodge is used for, it's used for dodge. Then we apply various modifiers. Any combatant selecting a non-default aim zone, anything other than one, gets a 10-point penalty. Heft penalty, if you're not strong enough to use the designated weapon. 10-point penalty to defenders for each threatening opponent beyond the first of which the defender is aware. This is called being outnumbered. 20-point penalty if prone. Reach penalty for anyone making an attack. Impairment and fatigue penalties. Thrust bonus for anyone making an attack with a thrusting weapon. Note that against ignore defenses, reach and thrust modifiers do not apply. Once all EMLs are calculated, the opposed tests are made and victory stars are awarded. Outcomes. Like in missile combat, CF0s produce fumble rolls and CF5s produce stumble rolls. If both parties fail, then no strikes occur. Ties must be broken, and these are determined primarily by the defense mode selected. Blocks win ties, and weapons are checked for damage. Counterstrikes lose ties. Dodge ties are awarded to whoever rolled higher, and if no one rolled higher, another determining factor may be used. Who had the higher EML, who has the higher initiative, something like that. For attackers and counter-striking defenders, a 1-star success gives a basic strike, and each additional star may be spent on tactical advantages. For defenders blocking or dodging, a 1-star success means the attack failed, and any extra stars can be spent on the tactical advantages. Now, what are all these tactical advantages we've been mentioning? The first star always applies to base strike impact. Each additional star is used on tactical advantages. Some of these have limitations depending on the attack and defense type, and others apply automatically, as we saw with precision when striking a still target in missile combat. The 4 main TAs are precision, impact, setup, and action. Precision allows the player to roll extra dice when determining the zone struck, or maybe even the location, during the injury sequence. It lets you choose between at least 2 locations to determine which you'd prefer to hit. Impact TAs provide extra strike impact. The setup TA lets you improve the success level of either a melee or dodge test until your turn in the next round. That means you could maybe turn a failure into a success, or a success into a critical success, that sort of thing. And the action TA allows the character to perform any one of the following: an immediate extra attack, evade, a half move, a grope, get in close, an action that goes beyond our scope for this tutorial, or the garbage option, pass.
Now, let the blood flow freely, freshly, frighteningly, from the gaping chasms of newly rended wounds.
A little dramatic, but that'll do, pig. That'll do. At this point, we know we hit someone, whether it was a missile or melee attack. We just need to know where we struck them. To do this, we roll a zone die and a location die at the same time. The zone die shows us the zone that was hit, and the location die shows us the body part. For locations that need differentiation between right or left, like arms and legs, the GM makes the decision as to how this is determined, probably most often with even and odd rolls of dice, or a D2. If a precision tactical advantage is used, an extra zone die is rolled. The same location die is compared against both zones, and the attacker chooses which location to hit. If, however, the zones are identical, not identical rolls, identical zones, then the attacker rolls an extra location die and chooses that result. One final word on zones. The default aim zone is 1. A zone die, aimed at zone 1, returns the appropriate zone number. But if we're aiming for a different zone, our zone roll starts at that zone and we count from there. For example, targeting a boar. If I'm aiming at the torso, which begins at zone 5, a roll of 5 on a d6 zone die would hit zone 9, the rear. There could be any number of reasons to target a specific zone, but there's a risk. It is possible that the zone die can fall outside of the available range, and if that happens, the strike is actually a miss. Impact. Knowing where we hit, we next determine how hard the strike is and if it's strong enough to penetrate any armor at that location. Strike impact is determined by first rolling the weapons or projectiles damage die. To that, we add weapon impact modifiers, range, charge, and or strength modifiers, and any impact tactical advantages. For example, with this here hand axe, I roll a 3 on a d8, add 5 edged impact for the weapon, and with a 16 strength, I add another 3 impact. Now, if I didn't score a critical success, my basic strike impact is 11 edged. Then we consult the armor value on the struck location for the strike aspect, edged, blunt, piercing, or fire and frost. This is deducted from the strike impact, and it gives us what we're going to call the effective impact. In this case, the boar's hide reduces the strike by 2, giving an effective impact of 9 edged. Injury. The effective impact determines the injury's severity. These are minor, serious, and grievous wounds, and these are nicely grouped in categories of 5. Well, except for minors, which it's 1 to 4, but you get the point. The player records the injury severity on the character profile. If a location is struck where there is already an existing injury, there's a chance that an injury actually increases in severity in addition to receiving the new injury. That's going to complicate things later on when we get to healing, not covered in this tutorial. If the target wears rigid armor, like some sort of plate, edged and piercing strikes of minor severity do not score an injury, although we still have to test for shock. With all of that said, it is important to recognize that injury severity can lead to further complications, namely bleeding and amputation. If there's a circle next to a body location, it means that there's a risk of a bleeding wound. Now look, almost all wounds bleed, right? It's kind of almost the definition of a wound. The term bleeding in HarnMaster Kethira, though, it's going to indicate that there's a real risk of death due to continued blood loss. A triangle next to a body location means that if a grievous 5 injury was scored with an edged weapon, the target must test strength to determine if that limb is severed, with obviously grim implications. As a final note, any bolt or arrow that scores at least an S3, that projectile is considered impaled, and it's going to require special surgery to be removed. They ain't just yanking that thing out in combat. For this tutorial, this is really just color, but it's going to have real implications when healing and recovering from an injury. Shock. By now, we have struck a body part and caused some sort of injury. Resulting from that, we have to determine if the combatant is able to continue fighting. This is accomplished by determining the state of shock. We calculate a shock index using 3 factors. We take the default shock value for the body location that was struck, the numerical value of the injury severity, and the value resulting from a shock roll. The sum of these gives us a shock index, and that's going to correlate to a particular shock state. Any shock index of 6 or less provides no shock. That combatant can continue fighting as normal, maybe with some penalties for the injury. An index of 7 is stunned. Stunned combatants have movement penalties, reduce all success levels of tests involving the injured location by 1, and retest shock every round until the shock state changes. Incapacitated combatants, those with a shock index of 8, fall prone and are unaware. They can't act without assistance and have to make a shock reroll next round. This shock reroll is different than retesting shock. It's a special kind of roll. It has a 20-point penalty and risks entering extended shock for quite some time. A shock index of 9 makes someone unconscious. They are unaware, helpless, and make a shock reroll after 10 minutes. Finally, shock index 10, dead. Combatants who are incapacitated, unconscious, or dead are considered vanquished. To wrap up the injury routine, we finalize any effects that come with the acquired injury, and this is determined by the injury severity. Minor wounds have no immediate effect unless the shock roll was a fail. If that happens, then tests involving the wounded part suffer a 5-point penalty. Serious wounds impart a 10-point penalty to all tests involving that body part, and the combatant may have to make a stumble or fumble roll. And grievous wounds prevent the uses of skills involving that body part, and that combatant automatically fails any fumble or stumble rolls. Keep in mind what this means. Even if a combatant somehow survives a shock roll with no shock state, a grievous wound to the torso prevents that actor from using basically any combat skills. So, you got all that? Memorized it and ready to go? Of course not. And don't be surprised either. It's just a different style of a system. And like any system, it takes some playing and observing to really get it. Just like when you learn any other game. There should be enough in here, though, for you to now return to the combat demo, rewatch it, and see if it makes a lot more sense. I'd wager that you can follow along with it quite nicely now, and by its end, you will be ready to try your own combat. As a reminder, this was not a comprehensive combat tutorial. It did get a little deep here and there, which is great, but there are still a few other nuances and technicalities that we're saving for another day. For now, you should have nearly all that you need in order to run generic combat scenarios in HarnMaster Kethira. To go further in depth, or to get started on your own, visit Celestia.com and get yourself a copy of HarnMaster Kethira. With that, you can not only start finding groups with whom to play, but you can begin creating your own in-depth adventures and scenarios. Now that I said it, that's probably a great idea if I do say so myself. And I did. Try the combat scenario yourself with some characters that you make on your own. Or better yet, try creating some scenarios of your own and share them with others, people just like you, on the HarnMaster Kethira forum and on its Discord channel. Battle on!